and it's tap, tap, tap. Here comes Sean McDermott, heading up to the GPO. He goes to join his comrades in a fight they cannot win, but still he limps on proudly, tapping with a grin.
Now, could you tell me who you are, please?
I'm Patricia Walsh, Nee McDermott, grandniece of Sean Mac Diarmada. My grandfather was Sean's brother, and I have met Sean's three sisters who were alive when I was young, and also his brother Seamus, who is the author of the Gaelic American, and his sisters May, Rose and Kate.
My name is Maura, my love is Grant, and I'm also a grandniece of Sean Mac Diarmada. My grandfather being the same grandfather as Patricia's, Pat, and he had 6 living children, and my mother was one of them. And when I was a child, I also met the the aunts, because I used to come here every summer.
Sure.
For my summer holidays from I was a baby until I was about 14.
Okay.
Well, my name is Rose Mylonis, and I will be a great grandniece of Sean Mac Diarmada. He's a great grandnephew of Sean Mac Diarmada.
Well, I'm Hubert McMorrow from Kiltyclogher and Manorhamilton area here, and my relationship is that Sean Mac Diarmada's mother was Mary McMorrow, a sister of my great grandfather. So my relationship is that my grandfather was a first cousin of Sean McDermott, so I'm a first cousin twice removed of Sean McDermott's.
Yeah, Marcus, my name is John McManus. I'm a kind of proud Leitrim man. Grew up not far from Cormore, 10 miles away, and very proud of Leitrim connections and proud of Sean McDermott. In Leitrim we don't have any All-Ireland medalists or anything, we have Sean McDermott, and I think with the help of your video and everything it'll show what a great man he was and what he's done for his country.
Okay. So I learnt a lot of the history from my grandfather. We used to sit outside, and if I wasn't too bored I'd be sitting listening, but I wasn't a terribly good child, so I didn't listen all the time. But he used to tell me about, he knew Connolly well, and he knew Bilmer Hobson, and he used to say Sean used to have a bit of a problem sometimes trying to keep Connolly and Pearse together on the same page, you know, because of different ideas, but he managed. My grandfather Pat, known as Pat Donnell, was born here in 1869, and he was the eldest of 10 children, and Sean was the 8th. Grandfather and great grandfather were skilled carpenters, and they made a lot of the furniture in the house.
So could you tell me what his childhood was like?
Well, his childhood would have been a reasonably happy one from a point of view that all of the McDermotts were tradespeople. They were carpenters and stonemasons, and we can see some of the work that they've done building bridges and that type of thing, so they would have had some bit of an extra income. The farm where he was born and reared was very poor land, a smallish farm but a very poor land. But I suppose the biggest shock to Sean Mac Diarmada was his mother dying when he was 9 years of age. He was then looked after by one of his older sisters, but I'm thinking if you read something, he had made that references, I think, to Tom Clark's wife, of never having known a mother's love.
Kathleen Clark recalls in her book Revolutionary Woman, Sean remarking, "I have never known a mother's love, and I've always longed for it. I've tried to picture what my mother would have been like. You fit that picture. I missed all you give your children."
So his mother died at 47, very young, and he would never have had great memories of her. But he was quite bright going to school. He went to Curracloon Primary School, which is midways between Glenfarne and Kiltyclogher, down on the shores of Loch Macnean. He would have walked down through the bogs to school. Not a very pleasant trip for anyone, possibly barefooted a good part of the year.
He stayed on at school, you know, after most children had gone, because he was a very good scholar.
Sure.
And I saw some of his exam results, you know, and his maths wasn't that bad, but his essays were very anti-British imperialism, so that might have had something to do with him not passing, you know, to be a teacher, not getting into the college.
He carried on at school because it was his ambition to be a primary school teacher, but he always had great difficulty with maths. But primary school teacher at that time had to study up to 8 different subjects, Irish not included. And that, so he had difficulty with the maths, and he carried on at school till he was about 16, working as a sort of a sub-teacher with the smaller pupils under the direction of the teacher that was there at that particular time.
In 1903, Sean wrote an essay on the British Empire in an entrance exam to the British teaching system. He has said, "Colonies are of use to England, but for poor deluded Ireland, nothing is of any use until the yoke of English tyranny is shaken off."
He was tried to do for the King's Scholarship, which was something, but having read St. people said that he had very little hope of passing that, because his tutors would not, even though the principal of the school was a principal, would not have the knowledge that they were able to give to him that he would pass it. He was very, very upset. Himself and the principal's son were the only 2 that stayed to 6th class. But some of the old people that I spoke to some years ago would have said that his great love for Irish came from not being allowed to learn Irish at school. His mother would have been a fluent Irish speaker, because my great-grandfather was a fluent Irish speaker. All the people in Cardenmore, the most of them, Irish would have been their first language in the 1800s. Now, maybe there was a lot of trouble in Cardenmore with the local landlord, Lord Tottenham, because Lord Tottenham had run into huge difficulty in the 1880s. He had mortgaged his entire estate for the construction of the Sligo Leitrim Great Northern Railway. Then he was the MP, and so Tottenham, even though there were worse landlords than Tottenham, he started evicting people. He was desperate for money.
Now on the shores of Loch McNain there stood a mansion grand, and the landlords that did dwell there were amongst the cruelest in the land. 39 families Lord Tottenham did rout, and later Colonel Adamson 100 more cast out. The pain of these evictions young McDermott saw firsthand, and there and then the rebel vowed to one day make a stand. I'll rid the Irish nation of their likes forevermore. The pledge of Sean Mac Diarmada, the pride of Curranmore.
But he went to Edinburgh as well, and he stayed with some family members. He was afraid of getting them into trouble because he was being watched even then by the authorities. You know, they said, "Oh, he's Irish, he's up to something." So that's why he left Edinburgh to go back to Belfast.
And then when he returned from Edinburgh and he went up to Tonamoyle, up on the Cavan Leitrim border there for a winter to do bookkeeping, because he intended to do something like that when he didn't go for teaching. But the teacher up there who was very interested in the Irish language, and fluent Irish, so McDermott really picked up more Irish than he did bookkeeping.
Okay.
But he had intended to, he was going to have to immigrate. And then of course he felt if he had something like bookkeeping that might help him with a job. So he went to Belfast, where he already had some of his older siblings were there.
Apparently he lived in Hannistown, where I was brought up when I was a child, just outside of Belfast. But he liked a wee smoke, Sean, as I used to as well. And I think he got the sack for smoking.
The original photo, as you can see, of Sean McDermott as a tram conductor.
Wow.
And you see the lady's hat and everything, and Victoria Street, the number, the advertising on the front of it.
Wow.
So that was his first sort of job. Didn't last too long there. Caught smoking. Sacked.
Okay.
And he was smoking and he was putting them on the paths. And this was this was the second time, the second job. Like, he's the only man that got really, fell out over smoking once on the saddleboard up in the trams.
Oh yeah, you see the picture.
And he also got this into trouble with his relatives over putting the butts onto the path in this lovely garden.
So at that stage, it just happened by accident at that stage that the lodging house he was staying in, they were very active in the Dungannon clubs or in the different organisations of the Republic. And so MacDiarmada became very interested in this. He was quite a good organiser apparently, and very good at motivating people, and very good at that. So they decided then, Bulmer Hobson and a few of people, that they would pay him the same wage as he was getting as a tram conductor.
And Bulmer Hobson would have met him at the Dungannon clubs, is that right?
Yeah, Bulmer Hobson would have met him, and McGarry and all the different people that was involved in the Dungannon clubs. But he went round the place, and I mean, some of the first meetings that he spoke at, I think he was having a bit of difficulty, because speaking in public isn't, that time there was no amplification.
Yeah.
You had to be able to deliver, but he became quite good at it in the end. And then, of course, he met Arthur Griffith and Tom Clark. So, when there was a bit of in the party then, when Redmond, when the Conservatives again got overall and the Home Rule seemed to be dead in the water, and 2 or 3 MPs resigned, but only Dolan resigned his seat in North Leitrim.
Yeah.
He was the MP for North Leitrim. And he was young, of course, and had only been elected in the election before that. So along with resigning, he resigned his seat. So MacDiarmada came back here then, and he became what would be known in today's term Director of Elections. So then they published the Leitrim Guardian newspaper, which ran for about 3 years.
Okay.
Published in Manorhamilton. Take that. Of course, he got later on. Then he was very, very disappointed. There was great disappointment at the failure in the by-election of 1908.
Later he told Tom Clark all the tactics they had employed to win the election. Tom spoke severely to him. "Sean, I would rather lose an election than resort to tricks to win it. Our cause is too sacred. Neither should we participate in an election to the British Parliament." Startled, Sean opened his beautiful eyes. "Tom, I never looked at it like that before. There's my hand on it. I promise you never to take part in such proceedings again." He kept his word. He threw in his lot with the IRB and was appointed organiser. He was a wonderful organiser, full of charm and magnetism, and very handsome. He never spared himself and was all over the country. He was a very lovable character and became Tom's loyal and loved comrade. They trusted each other completely. Kathleen Clark.
Because Sean MacDiarmada was very involved in the GAA, actually there's a hurley, I think it's maybe in the National Museum, that he made. Some people said that he couldn't play hurling, but it was a great way of getting around to meet the young people. It was a great way of spreading the gospel sort of thing by pretending that he was greatly involved.
I got this book a number of years ago, over 10 years ago, The Making of Ireland and Its Undoing.
Oh, and that's Stafford Green.
That's Stafford Green.
Sure, he's a big fan of Roger Casement's, yeah.
And very interesting, because Sean has spelt his name in the old style. SCG for the N, Mac Diarmada, man for 26 Alma Domino 08, so 13, he's in his 20s, early 20s.
So that's 1908, isn't it?
1908, yeah. 8 years before the rebellion. This is an important, very rare to get anything with MacDiarmad's signature on it.
Totally.
Because he was very, very secretive.
Yeah.
Didn't want anything.
So he planned a revolution, preached the fiery gospel of the free, promised an end to persecution, till the time was right to strike for liberty.
So, could you tell me about the newspaper Irish Freedom? What was that used for?
Well, that was used to get their message out there. There was no other way of getting the message across.
Sure.
At that particular time. And, you know, some of the things I've learned recently too is there was talk about the involvement of the Abbey. There were an awful lot of small theatrical groups, and they were acting as the medium to get their message across. And in some instances, some of the plays was Gaelic. So even if the British were there, they had no idea what was going on. So the paper Irish Freedom, the Leitrim Guardian that you had here in Leitrim, which again publicised that how else were you going to get your message across? There was no other form of media.
February 1911, Irish Freedom declared, "We stand for self-development individually and as a nation. If we do not go forward, we must collapse. It is a matter of life or death." October 1911, Irish Freedom, which was managed by Sean, argued, "Our country is run by a set of insolent officials. The executive power rests on an armed force that preys on the people with batons if they have the gall to say they do not like it. The police, who are paid for by the Irish taxpayer, answered to Dublin Castle." August 1912 and October 1913, Irish Freedom. The IRB respected people who stood up for themselves. The campaigners for women's suffrage were applauded as fighters for freedom. The Impressionist painters were welcomed to Dublin in 1911 for their determination to achieve self-expression.
As Sean Mac Diarmada was the head of Irish Freedom, the magazine with the Irish Republican Brotherhood.
Yes.
And this is for Dunleary, Messrs Walker shop for the magazine. And he signed Sean Mac Diarmada 29th to the 11th. 12. You still see the Mac Diarmada signature, but he's changed the spelling of it now to the more traditional S-E-A for the N.
Irish Freedom was launched in November 1910. It was founded by Tom Clark with the financial help from John Daly and Patrick McCartan. It nailed its colours to the mast immediately with an editorial declaring, "We stand not for an Irish party but for a national tradition. Wolfe Tone, Emmet, Mitchell and O'Leary. We stand for the complete and total separation of Ireland from England and the establishment of an Irish government, untrammelled and uncontrolled by any other government in the world." Before 1913, it was accusing Redmond of crawling imperialism. The staff and contributors included Bulmer Hobson as editor, Sean Mac Diarmada as manager, the O'Rahilly, who under the pen name of Rapparee produced articles on military matters, Padar Carney first published the Soldier Song, which later became Era Naveen, our national anthem, Porrick Pierce wrote From a Hermitage, Terence McSweeney wrote On Principles of Freedom, and Tom Clark wrote Glimpses of an Irish Felon's Prison Life. Pearse and Ciant wrote sympathetically on the 1913 Dublin lockout. According to the Garrity papers, McDermott has said the following on James Larkin and the 1913 lockout. "He did good work with a difficult crowd and against terrible opposition in getting better conditions." This publication helped ensure the IRB played a pivotal role in the founding of the Irish Volunteers in 1914. September 1914, Irish Freedom railed against the priest hunters, the rack, the half-hangings of 98, the famine when 1 million slowly starved to death. The Chief Commissioner of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, in a secret memo, said the paper represented the most extreme section in the country.
He would try and stop all the Irish people from joining up with the English forces against, say, Redmond and the likes, you know.
Irish Freedom, December 1914. The newspaper was closed down for agitation against recruitment of Irishmen for the British forces in the First World War. It was suppressed by the British government at the end of 1914.
Yeah, but there was the mention of that he also was probably the only paid revolutionary that there was.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
From
that's
Dennis
right,
and Bulmer
that's right.
Hobson, actually, they paid him after he lost his job on the
Yeah.
trams.
That's
They
right,
said,
yeah, that's
they said,
right.
what you should do
That's
for
right.
us is we'll pay whatever they paid you, and you can organise all the GAA clubs and go around what you did in the Dungannon clubs and go around all Ireland.
Yeah.
And he got on a bicycle and did
That's
that.
right.
But they must have seen some potential in him to do
Oh,
that.
they did.
Oh, yeah.
He was
Yeah.
a fantastic orator.
Yeah, yeah.
The references of him speaking like is quite amazing. Like
Yeah.
this man could talk.
Yeah.
He could really talk, and he had a Cornmore accent. But whatever way he
Yeah.
spoke to
Yeah.
people and his sparkly eyes, you can see the
Yeah.
pictures of him.
Yeah.
He was a walk-in. You know, people listened to him.
People liked him.
Loved him. And so he was like very much. They wanted him to represent the movements
Okay.
and organise
Yeah.
everything, and he did
He
that.
was very charismatic.
Yeah.
And Tom Clark liked him a lot because he met him with Bulmer Hobson and
Oh, was
they
it around
went
that period,
to,
was it? Or
yeah, when they went to Dublin. You
When
know,
he went to Dublin
to the
later
wee
on.
news agents that Tom Clark owned.
Yes,
And
that was
Tom
it.
took to him right away.
That was a cover then for the IRB.
Kathleen Clark as well was very taken by him as well.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
She was so much younger than
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah.
So. And he was very charming with the ladies, I believe.
I heard that.
Yeah.
Right.
And he was well, if he lived, he would have got married to Meg Ryan.
That's right.
Yeah. I met her brother actually.
Really?
Yeah, James Ryan. He was a minister in the Fianna Fáil government.
He's not the guy who's the doctor in the GPO in 1916.
Yeah.
I think himself and Clark
Yeah.
wanted to get into everything that was going on and get their own people.
Yeah, he used
at
IRB
the
to
front,
kind of
you know.
infiltrate other
Yeah.
movements.
Yeah, and to get on to build the volunteers.
Yeah,
They were using
see-
all the,
yeah.
the Gaelic
Yeah.
clubs, all the Gaelic outlets,
That's
all
right.
the people that
Yeah.
were doing, and that's what his job was, to organise this.
Yeah.
One of the hotbeds of IRB activity was the Keating branch of the Gaelic League. Some of the members included Cathal Brua, Thomas McDonough, Thomas Ashe, and Eamon Cant. They would all play prominent parts in the 1916 Rising. The branch had its own Irish language journal called Banba, as well as a drama society. McDiarmada would act in many of these plays in Irish.
Well, again, you see, I think that Tom Clark saw a younger version of himself, and his health wasn't the best after terms in jail and that type of thing. So McDiarmada was young, he was active, he was full of energy, and I think that Tom Clark saw that in him. So he was the organiser of the entire country, and if you look through, you see photographs of him down in Cork and Galway, and he always brought his bicycle with him on the trains and moved around. So there'd be very few counties in Ireland that I think McDiarmada wouldn't have visited at some stage.
In 1911, an onset of a limp was showing, according to Eamon Martin. Eamon Martin had fought at Church Street in 1916. Sean had been working very hard, travelling all over the country as a full-time organiser for the IRB. He also managed Irish Freedom, the IRB organ. In 1911, he was the leader of the campaign to counter the display of loyalty to the British King George V, who was visiting Ireland. Sean gave all his time to this. The biggest counter-demonstration was at Bodenstown in July 1911. On the way home, at Usher's Island on the Keys, as we marched in military formation from Kingsbridge, he was involved in a fracas with the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Sean, in the thick of the melee, was injured. Very soon after that, he was struck down with what was believed to be poliomyelitis. He went into hospital it was the matter. Thereafter, he walked with a limp, a short or crooked leg, and always carried a stick. An interesting snippet about Sean McDermott and polio and the pronunciation of his name is taken from the book The Years Flew By, Recollections of Sidney Gifford Sierra, John Brennan. Whenever I see the name of Sean McDermada appearing in print in the anglicised form of Sean McDermott, I remember a scene in a Dublin hospital where Sean was a patient in 1911. To my surprise, the sister to whom I spoke urged me to come in and see him, assuring me that a visitor would cheer him up. I knew he had been at the point of death, so I expected to find him lying prone, weak, and hardly able to whisper a few words. Instead, I found him propped up with pillows and busily working on a Gaelic exercise, while the bed was strewn with Irish phrase books and grammars. He had grown a beard during his illness, and, with his face emaciated with suffering and his eyes looking bigger and brighter than before, he looked more like a saint than a soldier. Explaining why the hospital staff were making amends by giving him special privileges, he laughed heartily as he told me of a very angry scene between himself and a nurse who had insisted on writing his name on the chart in its English form of John McDermott. Sean, who was unable to raise himself in the bed, asked another patient to hand him the chart, and having got it, he tore it to pieces. The nurse was enraged and revenged herself for this act of defiance by giving Sean the minimum of attention, until her conduct so disgusted the other patients that they sent a report to the Reverend Mother. The nurse, unworthy of her calling, was dismissed. With characteristic generosity, Sean tried to have this sentence mitigated, but without success.
Yeah, when he was struck by polio, it set him back a lot, and he was in hospital for a long time, and it affected his leg, and he had to walk with a stick. And but he lost a lot of weight, and when he got better, then he started going around organising again.
And he was very, very weak when he came out of hospital, and I mean the Clarks took him in, and different people took, took him a long time to recover from it. And I don't think his strength ever came back to what it was. And it became a huge obstacle to him in his travelling around the country, because at that particular time an awful lot of the travelling was done on bicycles. So it really had a huge effect on him. It meant that I think, almost 12 months was taken out of his life. I think it also meant that he was in a sort of a hurry with the whole thing. I think it spurred him on, the urgency that was needed for a rising. So then, of course, his father died in 1913 as well, and that, was another thing that, it would have, the link with home was surely broken then, even though his father was an old man, but still the link with home was broken. Mother was gone, now the father was gone.
According to the McGarrity Papers, MS 17, 618, Sean tells Joe the death of his father knocked me about a good deal. His father was a Fenian in Leitrim, an IRB participant in the land wars, land agitation and resistance to landlords, who are described as descendants of the robber hordes sent over by Elizabeth, James, Cromwell and William of Orange. This is quoted in Irish Freedom, April 1914. This action dated back to the ribbon men of the early 19th century. In 1908, McDermott physically blocked an eviction. McDermott has said of the Ulster Volunteers, "We are not against Carson's volunteers, but to insist on our own right of citizenship."
According to Kathleen Clark, on Sunday the 26th of July 1914, the landing of arms was to take place in Howth. We were living over the shop in 77 Amiens Street. I remember the march past of the Irish Volunteers that morning and feeling very proud and wildly excited knowing what they were going to do. Sean was having dinner with us. Tom and Sean had engaged a cab to go to Howth to see how things were. Before dinner was over, I looked out the window and noticed that the Howth tram was full of British soldiers with rifles. I told Tom and Sean. They left their dinner and rushed off. The soldiers got off the tram at the junction of the Howth and Clontarf roads. The cab passed through them without interference. Tom and Sean were in a state of anxiety to reach the volunteers before the British soldiers. They met the volunteers on their return march with rifles, but no ammunition. Tom and Sean told them to drop their rifles in the hedges and ditches before the British soldiers reached them. Then, the two men took two of the rifles and drove back to Dublin with them. The soldiers were standing waiting for the volunteers. Once again, the cab passed through without interference. Tom and Sean came back to the house and left the rifles, took a couple of rugs and went back to Howth. They filled the cab with rifles, covered them with the rugs and again passed through the British soldiers. Tom and Sean saw the British soldiers and the Irish volunteers lined up facing each other at the Howth Clontarf junction. The British had expected an armed force, but the volunteers had none.
Of the 1914 Bachelor's Walk shootings, McDermott has said, "That ought to open the eyes of the fools as to what the Liberal government is." In Tralee, 1914, McDermott was speaking. He has said, "Nationalism, as known to Tone and Emmett, is almost dead in the country. Unless a blood sacrifice is made in the next few years, it will be necessary for some of us to offer ourselves as martyrs."
He was imprisoned in Tuam,
Yeah.
because he made a speech, and the next thing they threw him into prison.
At particular time, his main speeches were about discouraging people from joining the British Army and going to fight in the war, that there was a problem at home without that.
Yeah, I heard he was arrested. What was it? Defence Against the Realm Act for.
It was,
yeah.
It was defence. Well, that was what he was. You see, that he was encouraging people not to join the British Army. Now, the thing, of course, was that Liam Mellows was with him, so he's supposed to have been able to give his notebook and his revolver to Mellows, because it would have been a lot more serious if he hadn't got rid of the revolver. When the RIC were taking him away, he asked could he be excused for a minute, that he wanted to say something. So in that he gave his notebook where he had a lot of names and addresses, which would have implicated a lot of other people, and a revolver. He always carried a revolver in the latter years, and he was able to slip them to Mellows.
According to Kathleen Clark, Sean was arrested in Tuam 16th of May 1915 and charged with making a speech calculated to endanger the peace of the realm. He was convicted on evidence of a member of the RIC and sentenced to 4 months in prison. He was placed in Arbor Hill Military Detention Barracks, a very formidable, imposing place. The ponderous door was opened by a British soldier in answer to my ring. An officer appeared. "You wish to see the prisoner MacDiarmada. Why?" I said, "He may want food sent to him, a change of clothing." "It seems strange to me a friend should be so interested," he replied. I kept my temper. "I'll permit you to see him for 10 minutes. I heard Sean's stick and the slight drag of the leg along the passage. I put a brake on my welling tears. I gave him Tom's message and arranged a secret method of corresponding. On the 18th of September 1915, Sean was released from Mountjoy prison. Tom and I took him home to Richmond Avenue on a glorious sunny morning. We had breakfast in the garden, and basking in the sunshine, Sean was thrilled with his freedom. That morning was one of supreme peace and happiness. Although Min Ryan was teaching abroad, she and MacDiarmada, who had first met in 1905, kept in contact. From 1914 onwards, they were considered engaged. Min was a leading member of Cumann. She was extremely active in the organisation as secretary in 2 Dawson Street, Dublin, from 1915 onwards.
And of course the Ryans were very involved themselves. She had been used over and back to England, bringing all sorts of messages and different things.
Practically on a daily basis, the Ryan sisters met Sean Mac Diarmada in nearby Bewley's for a coffee. He also frequently visited the Ryan home, 19 Ranelagh Road. Min taught in the Rathmines Commercial College night classes in French and German.
Here we have a very important document in my eyes, probably yours too, Marcus, because we're going on here now. It's 26th of January 1915. A Cathal car, what about the Emmet celebration? I was talking to a few of the committee and I've been thinking it would be a mistake to drop the celebration. We've intended fixing Thursday night at 9 o'clock for a meeting. Tom, full stop, McGarry and myself are notified. I'll send word to Paddy McNally. Could you let the others know? Dakar, Sean Mac Diarmada. He says at 9 o'clock for a meeting. They don't say where the meeting is.
Sean Mac Diarmada was consumed with the need for secrecy. Tom Clark had told him stories of how the Fenians were consistently betrayed by informers and agent provocateurs. Sean had only left personal letters but no political testament. Ironically, his travel as IRB national organiser are detailed by police surveillance reports.
Sean MacDiarmada was under strict surveillance by the RIC in 1915. Here are 2 extracts from RIC files. 23rd of December 1915. With Thomas J. Clark at his shop in 75A Parnell Street, Joseph Murray, John MacDiarmada and John McGarry for half an hour between 8 to 9 p.m. 24th of December 1915. Thomas J. Clark and John MacDiarmada left Kingsbridge Station by 6:15 train en route to Limerick. RIC informed.
By 1915, Sean had lines of communication to all the leaders in the Irish Volunteers who had rejected Redmond's call to arms. A huge coordinated uprising had been planned by Sean. Hundreds were to be mobilised in Kerry and Limerick, 1,000 in Cork, 700 in Galway, and 1,300 in Armagh, Down, Louth and Meath. The biggest unit was 270 men in Dundalk. 4 brigades were raised in Dublin. German weapons would arm the southwest. This was his national plan. He did not envisage a blood sacrifice. Donal O'Hannigan, who was the commander of the Louth Volunteers, commented, I had seen the plans on 2 or 3 occasions, and Lee Mellows and I went over them in detail. The plans were kept in the safe at Volunteers headquarters in Dawson Street. Mac Diarmada had given O'Hannigan his orders about a fortnight before the rising. O'Hannigan recalls, "In the case of the country, it was expected they would rise. They had to attack and capture the British garrisons in their area." Dennis McCullough also recalls these detailed and complicated plans which would keep lines open to the west from the capital in case of a retreat from Dublin. Mac Diarmada's attention to detail is amazing. Explosives were acquired by sympathetic Irishmen working in quarries and mines in England. Transported to Ireland, men skilled in blasting were recruited for their expertise to blow up bridges and railway lines. Hand grenades were made from scrap metal. Bayonets were manufactured in the Irish Cutlery Company in Merchants Quay. This is validated by the 32-page Ireland report presented by Plunkett to Captain Nadolny in the German Foreign Office. The Supreme Council, led by Owen McNeill and Bulmer Hobson, were opposed to a rising, only under exceptional circumstances. James Connolly had feared the Great War was destroying socialism. Outside Liberty Hall, Mac Diarmada asked Connolly to get in the car with Pearse and Plunkett. Over a couple of days, they succeeded in convincing him that German aid was coming, that there were plans about which Owen McNeill knew nothing.
According to Kathleen Clark, Connolly disappeared for a few days to force the rising to occur. Sean was irritated. Damn the fellow and his tricks. The plans for an all-Ireland rising were not complete. Sean and all the military council were very angry with him. They considered his action childish. He had left instructions with Mallon to mobilise the citizen army if he ever disappeared. But Mallon had hesitated. Sean Riley remarked, "That will teach him a lesson."
Sean had people in lots of different places,
Yeah.
but he didn't write things down himself.
Yeah.
So people didn't know a lot about him. It was the castle, the people in the castle had been watching him, so they had all the information. And that's how it all came out in the last few years about how important he was. Because people, oh, look at that guy there, you know, he's like a cripple going about, and who's he and what's he got to do with the men? But in actual fact, he was like, well, you know, like one of the main leaders.
Absolutely.
Tom Clark, you know.
Because when I found out my research, I've made a documentary on Tom Clark.
Yeah.
And because Clark was under watch, because he'd already done stuff before, he couldn't.
He couldn't.
He had to be very careful
he had
about
to be
going
careful.
around. And Sean McDermott would be the person.
Yeah, and also Sean, because he'd been in prison.
Absolutely.
So they got Pearse to do a lot of the orations and things like that. You know, oh, they were clever men.
And I mean, you know, it was McDermott that decided that the best person to speak at the grave of O'Donnell and Rossa was Pearse. You know, had the rising happened as they envisaged it would have happened, then it could have been very successful, because if they had been able to attack all over the country and all the different towns and cities as it was planned.
But he had his eyes and ears everywhere, Sean McDermott.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And he had his contacts everywhere.
On Sunday, 16th April, at a meeting in Clontarf Hall, Sean told the meeting, "Paddy, Daly, has some great ideas about the magazine fort, and I would like you to hear what he has to say." Daly explained that during the daytime, large groups of footballers passed the fort on the way to the 15 acres playing field. He said there were enough high explosives in the fort to make a large bang. Clark, McDonough and McDermott agreed to use its huge explosion as a signal to all that the rising had begun. Young volunteers in the Fianna were to be employed in the attack. McDermott ordered him to take the fort, blow it up, but no loss of life if possible. Dermot Lynch describes the moment when McDermott gave him the plans for each building to be seized by the rebels. On Good Friday, while McDermott and myself lunched at the Red Bank restaurant, as we frequently did, Sean handed back to me the sketches for the Four Courts, Jacobs, South Dublin Union and Boland's areas for delivery to the respective commandants. That afternoon I handed them in person to Ned Daly at the Red Bank, where he and Pierce Beasley also had lunch. The German consignment with casement was lost. A countermanding order was issued by Owen McNeill, which prevented the mobilisation of many in the country. But McDermott pressed on. He felt that if Ireland did not show willingness to rise, the British government would claim that the Irish were content to be governed by the British.
Then one Easter Monday morning, he realised his plan. When poets stood with playwrights and rose up with the working man to fight the forces of King George and set the country free. Though he knew deep in his heart it could not end in victory, but in the glorious madness of a rising doomed to fail, he hoped his deeds would resurrect the spirit of the Gael. For 6 long days they battled till they could take no more. Enough, said Sean Mac Diarmada, the pride of Cornmore.
But the one reason that I think that McDermott pushed on with the rising was he knew. He was one of the very few people that knew the guns had not landed. He knew the guns had not landed in Kerry. He had that message. The general feeling is that people said, oh, it was informers that informed about Bannistrand and same thing about Galway. I don't think so. I think it's what the British had cracked the German code at that time, and they knew.
Okay.
Even though at the time it was better for them to say that it was informers.
But he had his plan,
Yeah.
and he was sticking to it.
Yeah.
Even so far that he put Bulmer's Hobson under house arrest when the counter remand, this man that had helped him to start with.
That's interesting, because I remember reading before there was a meeting maybe 2 or 3 months before, and Bulmer Hobson had made a speech, and McDermott especially was furious with him, like absolutely furious with him.
Bulmer Hobson was kidnapped because on the 16th of April he had stated that he was against precipitate action and scoffed at the idea of a rising. He was against anyone planning such an action. Nurse Aoife de Burke, witness statement 359. The shelling of the post office began that evening. McDermott was lying down to take a rest. He was not strong, he was lame. Towards the end of the week, Connolly lay wounded. Plunkett was seriously ill. The direction of the fight was conducted by McDermott, who acted with his usual geniality, thoroughness and imperturbability. The southern roof section of the GPO collapsed to the cheers of the surrounding British. The rebellion's leaders, McDermott, Clark and Plunkett, held the brief council of war. They concluded they would have to evacuate their headquarters, deciding that the Williams and Woods Sweet and Soap Factory would be the new general headquarters for the volunteer army. Sean sent to Frank Henderson in the rapidly disintegrating Metropole Hotel to inform Lieutenant Oscar Traynor that both the hotel and GPO were being evacuated.
Sean McLaughlin, witness statement 0290. I encountered Sean McDermott, who said, I've been looking for you. We were evacuating the post office and I want you to stay with us. I said, where do we evacuate to? And as I spoke, someone said, Williams and Woods. I replied, that is just mad. Williams and Woods is in the hands of the British. I believe Pierce said, well, O'Rahilly has just gone there. I said, my God, he'll be killed. It is certain death. Frank Burke, witness statement 694. As the street was being swept by machine gun fire, I could see the bullets like hailstones hopping in the street.
McDermott agreed to allow McLaughlin full control over the plan to break through the side walls of the buildings on Muir Street from its Henry Place side. A bullet-ridden van, which had been pulled from the mineral water factory yard, provided cover for Commandant Connolly, lying on a stretcher accompanied by Plunkett, Clark and others. Sean McDermott gave the signal to cross. Sean McLaughlin witness statement. A woman came to the door to see what was happening and was shot dead by one of our men. We thought we were being attacked. Sean went to console the mother, and I believe late in the night he gave her some of the money he'd been carrying for headquarters purposes. Sean McLaughlin witness statement. I took Sean into Sackville Lane. The O'Rahilly was lying on his back, arms outstretched, blood oozing from his body in a pool under him and flies buzzing around his head. Sean and I knelt and said an act of contrition. Desmond Ryan recalls a meeting conducted in low tones around Connolly's bed. At 12:45, Sean asked Miss Elizabeth O'Farrell to improvise some white flags. One of these McDermott hung out of the window of the room. Miss O'Farrell stepped out into the street, waving the white flag high above her head. There were tears in McDermott's eyes. Desmond Ryan also recalls, the officers called the men together and then marched through the ruined walls, company by company, to the warehouse at the rear of Hanlon's. Sean read Pierce's letter to them, sombre, with a hint of tears in his eyes, although his look was calm, clear and intense. Some men spoke in protest. Again he explained the situation. The only terms the British military authorities would listen to were an unconditional surrender. We surrendered not to save you, but to save the city, and the people of this city from destruction. You would have fought on. No matter, I am proud of you. You made a great fight. It was not your fault that you have not won the Republic. You were outclassed, that is all. They had the men, the munitions, the force. But this week of Easter will be remembered, and your work will tell someday.
Because the men all listened to him. Yeah. And the GPO, they listened to him. And when they wanted to surrender, he had to go and speak to them.
That's right.
They wouldn't listen to Pierce.
The London Irish.
They wouldn't listen. They listened to Sean, because they knew that he was like the real leader. He said to the other people apparently that they were going to be executed, but they should live another day and surrender and go to. But he seemed to know that would be their destiny.
I think that's why they held him in very high esteem, and he probably was one of the main contacts that they had. The people that came from England. Yeah. He was the person that they had been liaison with all the time. So therefore they held him in high esteem for that. I mean, Collins really held him in high esteem. I mean, Collins was much younger that time. And I mean, he really, really looked up to McDermott. You know what I mean?
McDermott and Willie Pearce led the main body of 200 men of the garrison through the yard's Moor Lane gate to Sackville Lane and left up Muir Street. A volunteer pulled a tricolour from inside his jacket and fixed it to his rifle. Eyes right to the GPO.
All the cripple by the English took away his cane, but they could not put him down. He did not fear the pain.
the rotunda. They surrendered at the Parnell Monument. The volunteers were detained outside the rotunda. Tom Clark and Sean McDermott were treated appallingly by an officer from Gorey, County Wexford named Captain Leah Wilson. Michael Collins witnessed the ill treatment and vowed to avenge it. The promise was kept 3 years later, and Captain Leah Wilson was shot. According to last words, at the Rotunda Hospital, McDermott was singled out for special ill treatment. His walking stick was taken by Captain Leah Wilson. McDermott said he could not walk without it. Wilson replied, "So, the Sinn Féiners take cripples in their army?" Sean replied, "You have your place, sir, and I have mine. You had better mind your place," according to Julia Grennan. Next morning, the prisoners marched to Richmond Barracks. Julia Grennan recalls, "Miss Carney and I waited back to help Sean McDermott. He had explained to the officer that he could not march. Sean didn't arrive there until about 3/4 of an hour after the rest. He limped in completely exhausted from being out all night at the Rotunda and from the effort to walk to the barracks."
And I know they made fun of him because, you can imagine after that week or 10 days how sort of drained of energy they were.
Yeah.
And McDermott, because of his disability and all that sort of thing, and that they took the stick from him, he had to walk without the stick. And
he must be exhausted.
Exhausted.
Yeah.
And they were exhausted because he was exhausted in the whole run up to the thing, running all over the country.
Fred O'Rourke of Jacob's Garrison recalls that while in a room in Richmond Barracks with 72 others, the door opened and McDermott, George and Jack Plunkett were pushed in. In a corner of the room was a large tank which the prisoners had been using as toilet accommodation. Full to overflowing, the stench in the room was unbearable. No sooner was Sean inside the door than, noticing the stench and the cause of it, he went mad with rage and started to kick the door. He continued to kick it and bang it with his fists until eventually an orderly came and opened it. Sean told him in no uncertain terms what he thought of the conditions, of the British Army in general, and of those in Richmond Barracks in particular. The result was that 10 buckets were produced, and in relays of 10, we were allowed to empty the tank, after which a quantity of chloride was thrown in. According to the book Those of Us Who Must Die, in Richmond Barracks, Tom Clark, very drawn looking, reasoned he was happy with the outcome. "We will die, but it will be a very different Ireland after us." McDermott concurred with Clark, suggesting with characteristic intensity that their executions would nip any remaining pro-English spirit in Ireland. According to Pierce Beasley, McDermott said to him, "There will be executions. I suppose I will be shot. But the executions will create a reaction in the country which will wipe out the slavish pro-English spirit."
After the rising, he nearly escaped.
He did.
That's right.
I mentioned about that. Or
Yeah, and so someone pointed him out.
Yeah.
That, and the man who pointed him out came to a sticky end himself.
He did.
That's right. Michael Collins actually ended up getting
What's
him.
his name? Cosgrove, was it?
No, it
What's
was.
his name?
I'll tell you. It was either Daniel Hoey or it was Smith.
Hoey.
It was Hoey. Yeah, Daniel Hoey. Yeah, and he gets him.
And Michael Collins said, "Well, you'll be next."
Yeah.
There's several quotes that Collins made of McDermott after it. And the one thing that Collins had was the people who give the evidence against him in the court was to chase them down and have them executed. So McDermott moved over into that group of people, and he almost got away with it. I think again maybe it was because they identified him from his limp that they brought him back into it.
Seamus Lang of Portumna remembers McDermott seemed to accept as inevitable that he would be shot. "Only Connolly and myself of the signatories are left. We'll be shot." That night a British officer came to the door and asked, "Is John McDermott here?" Sean, who was lying on the floor, stood up saying yes. He limped towards him. He had no stick. The officer handed him a slip of paper with the charge. You took part in an armed rebellion, waged war against His Majesty. He wouldn't even discuss the matter. Let's have a concert, he said. We did. Sean himself gave a recitation. Brian Boy McGee. The next morning, the court-martial was to be at 11. He begged the loan of a razor from a British Tommy, and having shaved and returned the razor, said to me with a smile, I have to make a nice corpse, you know.
They didn't have much on McDermott in the court-martial. They didn't have much on him, you know, enough to execute him, even though he had signed his name to the proclamation.
On General Maxwell's orders, they took him from his cell, and he hobbled to that prison yard where 13 of his comrades fell. Then they placed a blindfold on those eyes of cobalt blue. He stood there to attention, for his dreams would now come true. And when those Sherwood foresters took aim on that great dawn, their bullets would ensure the rebels' legacy lived on. His thoughts returned to Leitrim and Macnean's lonely shore. Then they martyred Sean Mac Diarmada, the pride of Corranmore.
Well, no. Grandfather apparently knew her as well.
Yeah.
Because I'd heard her name before.
Yeah.
And Sean says in his last letter, had he lived, he would have probably married her, you know. But then she went off and married Richard Mulcahy.
That's right, yeah.
And they had lots, I don't know, 4 or 5 children, didn't they? But but he was that secretive. She didn't know what was going on either.
That's right, yeah.
You know, because she was going about with messages on her bicycle.
That's right, yeah.
And
he definitely says if he had lived that she'd probably have been his wife. She was one of the people that spent a lot of that night, herself and her sister, in the cell with him before his execution. And she's referred to in his last letter, and yeah, I think she was the love of his life. And I think that's one of the things as well, is that, you know, to the Mulcahys, who she later married, that they've given to the archives some of the letters that she had that was between the two of them, you know. So I think that was a nice gesture that the letters were kept. I think McDermott thought that it wouldn't have the impact. If they were executed, then it would have the impact.
in the last letter he said how proud he is and how happy, you know. Brave, the whole lot of them, so brave, you know.
Excerpt from John Daly, 11th of May 1916, Kilmaine in prison. My dear Daly, I expect in a few hours to join Tom and the others in a better world. I know now what I have always felt, that the Irish nation can never die. Posterity will judge us aright from the effects of our action.
Kathleen Clark wrote about the last note she received from her husband Tom. Before his trial, Tom had given his silver watch to a soldier in Richmond Barracks to deliver this note. Some weeks after the rising, it was delivered. On the back of the note, Sean had written, "Dear Koch, I never felt so proud of the boys. 'Tis worth a life of suffering to be with them for 1 hour. God bless you all, Sean." I could imagine Sean's grin of mischief when he wrote, "Dear Koch," as he had never dared to address me as other than Mrs. Clark.
The morning of his mass, of his execution in Kilty, there were only 12 people at it.
All right. Really?
That's right, yeah. There were only 12 people at his mass the morning of his execution.
An excerpt from the letter to his brothers and sisters on the 11th of May 1916 in Kilmainham prison. My dear brothers and sisters, this is just a wee note to say I've been tried by court-martial and sentenced to be shot, to die the death of a soldier. I die, that the Irish nation may live.
Min Ryan has said, we were there at 12 o'clock and remained till 3 on the 12th of May. He was shot at 3:15. The message was brought to us by an army car and we returned in it. They sent word first, I think, that they were calling.
Yeah, she was with him in Kilmainham.
Yeah, when he died.
The night before he died, herself and her sister.
Yeah.
Wasn't he cutting
And
buttons,
he cut off the buttons and stuff and that, yeah, and everything he had, yeah. He gave them to her, yeah.
We had to call to the North Circular Road to collect Sean Reynolds and Sean McDermott's landlady. Sean wanted Sean Reynolds to make his will for him. He had not very much to leave, just a few pounds for masses. He handed me mementos which I gave to various people. Buttons to Moira Cregan and Margaret Brown. We were all there together, listening to each other's conversation. He was very anxious to have the others go. He was much more intimate with us, but there was no budge out of them. That is all now, Sean would say, but there was no budge at all. Then we all came out together.
We talked an awful lot about the week of the Rising and about how other places fared. I was the last to say goodbye to him. He kissed me and said, we never thought it would end like this, that this would be the end. A poem by Monsignor Ryan in Maynooth. No dimness born of agony and fear was in those spirit eyes when carelessly they faced the rifles at the grey of dawn. Sean McDermott was executed on the same day as Connolly, and they were the last of the signatories of the proclamation to die.
Yeah. Now, could you tell me what Michael Collins thought about Sean McDermott?
I can. He was actually quoted as saying, if I had 1/4 the strength of Sean Mac Diarmada, I am satisfied. Where he walked, they went with him all the shades of the great Irish men of the past. He was God-given. He was humble in his knowledge of his own greatness and in his task which he has chosen to do. He did not seek glory as a personal investment, but as a national investment. He was not Sean Mac Diarmada, he was Ireland.
Brilliant.
Now, could you tell me about Rose, if that's okay?
Yeah, Rose was one of Sean's sisters. She was the nearest to Sean in age. And in 1966, she came over here from America, to take part in the celebrations and whatnot. And in that year, they were decided to give out medals to the families of the 7 leaders. But Rose said she didn't want a medal, and that was grand. And she was picked, to go to Dublin to take the medal, but she said no. And her sister Maggie said no. They were very staunch no women. And one day the guards turned up, 2 guards and 1 or 2 nuns, I'm not sure how many. And Rose was in her 80s, so they took Rose off in the squad car off to Dublin, to wherever they were giving out, wherever the ceremony was, and she was supposed to get an honorary degree and to get a medal, for the family. But Rose said no, she wasn't. They brought her in and she said, you can bring me anywhere you want, I don't want it until Ireland's 32 county. Ireland's got the 32 counties, not just 26.
President Eamon de Valera at the National University of Ireland in 1966, while conferring honorary degrees on 6 of the nearest living relatives of the 7 signatories of the proclamation, declared, "We all know that Sean Mac Diarmada was one of the noblest and bravest of men, that he spent the best years of his life in organising to get together those who would be prepared to fight for Irish freedom.
in the town of Kiltyclogher, a monument does stand to a proud and noble Leitrim man who lived and died for Ireland. He organised an army and he stood against the crown, so Irish men and women would no more be beaten down.
And the people of Leitrim, they actually gathered all the money they possibly could. It's a really brilliant piece that is there.
The boy from Kiltyclogher, so much more to give. You died for dear old Ireland, so the nation might live. And it's damn your concessions, England, on our country. I died that the nation might live. I'm not just Sean Mac Diarmada, I am Ireland. For my life I gladly give. For my life I gladly give. And it's damn your concessions, England, we want our country. I died that the nation might live. I'm not just Sean Mac Diarmada, I am Ireland. For my life I gladly give. For my life I gladly give.
The interest that's in it round here was last Thursday morning when I was down in the local primary school when the army were visiting.
Oh yeah,
I think they came from they were from Athlone.
Okay.
The army, 4 lads that came to the primary school.
Okay.
And I was down there in the morning and just went in to talk to the principal, and I went in 5th and 6th class. They were getting ready for the army to come. I started just telling them a few things.
Yeah.
And never before have I had such an audience as them children were.
Right.
They barely blinked
Yeah.
while I was talking. Absolutely. Well, different people would take different things out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that makes people most proud of is that somebody from this area, you know, who was not part of maybe, you know, Dublin, where there was greater opportunities in education and all that sort of thing, that somebody who left here to go to work as a tram conductor in Belfast in a few years' time was signing his name to the proclamation. And I think the one thing too, that he was the only one signed his name as Gaelic.
And driven by desire to rekindle freedom's flame, he signed a proclamation that rejected England's claim to Ireland and her people, her destiny restored. The man was Sean Mac Diarmada, the pride of Curranmore.
And locally then, I think the best thing that's happened in the last number of years is the summer school, which is held in Kiltyclogher each year. It's held in the month of June.
In 2016, the children of St. Macartan's National School raised a tricolour as part of their Proclamation Day activities. The flag was raised by Theo Trickus, who is a great-great-grandnephew of Sean Mac Diarmada.
Here comes Sean McDermott, heading up to the GPO. He goes to join his comrades in a fight they cannot win, but still he limps on proudly, tapping with a grin. Easter Monday morning, 1916, taking part in the greatest battle Ireland's ever seen. He knew what stood in front of him, he was happy with his lot.